Hey guys, welcome back to our The Best Milk Bread Recipe Experiment series finale. Yay! So we've tested about 6 recipes now, and over the course of weeks we've also retested them, calibrating, determining, quality assurance, making sure it's really our favorite recipe out of all of them. Can you guess which one it is? We've tested 6 of the most popular online recipes for milk bread. Chopstick Chronicles, Umi's Baking, Josh Wiseman, Inga Lam, and also Kitchen Princess Bamboo. Her 2 recipes. And all of them turned out super tasty, so it is a little bit down to preference. But before we get into the comparison, let's go over some of the milk bread making tips that we've kind of accumulated over this course of the experiments, and hopefully as you get started, or as you're still finessing and tweaking your own recipes, these tips might help you out. 1. Don't forget to bring all of your ingredients to room temp before starting. This is important because if you don't, you might kill the yeast that you're using. And speaking of yeast, depending on what type you're using, you may or may not have to bloom it. So obviously fresh and instant yeast, you do not need to bloom. Both mixing and resting times are super important because they allow the gluten to form. So if you rest more, you won't need to mix it or knead it as much, or vice versa. So you don't want to skip on these because they are really important to making the best fluffy and chewy and all that bread. Keep in mind also that the temperature or when you're making your bread will make a difference. We also learned this the hard way, but whether it's colder and it's like wintertime, or it's wet and rainy or humid wherever you're at, that's going to affect your dough. So obviously if it's colder, it's going to take longer to rise. You might have to use a proofer, or maybe even set your oven on the lowest temperature and just kind of like let your bread rise in, or your dough rise in the oven. And then if it's rainy or really wet, then that's also going to affect the dough, and it might feel a lot stickier or wetter. So you might have to adjust a little bit, start by dusting some flour first and kind of work it until you get the dough that you want. But of course, knowing the ideal dough texture is going to come with time and with like repetitive baking of bread. So don't be discouraged, and try your best. And really, it's not as bad as it seems. Okay, that's not that reassuring, but out of all the bread that we've made, there's rarely been a time where we've like completely bombed it and the bread was like not edible. So I think this particular bread is a really good starter or introduction into bread baking. Okay, on to our very detailed analysis of these 6 recipes. We just used the baker's percentage and basically converted all of the recipes. So you can see this beautiful chart that we've created so that we can directly compare the recipes and look at, their hydration percentage, or also it's a really useful tool for scaling your recipes. So across the recipes, the highest hydration percentages were found in Princess Bamboo's recipe, which kind of made sense given the crumb that it ended up having. Josh Wiseman had the lowest despite using a starter. And the highest sugar percentage was Josh's, and then of course Inga's, and then finally Umi's at a nice medium range of 9.7. The highest butter content was also Josh's at 12.3%. And then we had some interesting use cases like Umi and Inga using dry milk powder, and then of course Josh and Umi using an egg. So all of these kind of different tricks and hacks to adding moisture or adding fat to the bread to make it the desired texture. The quickest recipe would be Chopstick Chronicles or Umi's, because they had the longest knead or mix time, so then they could have a shorter rest period. Everyone else's was the opposite, with a short mix time and a longer rest period, or more rest period. Okay, so also in our series, we mentioned that using the starter extends the shelf life of the bread, or at least that was the theory on using a starter. So to test that, we also sliced up our loaves and then stored them for a day and then a week, and then we also froze them and then tested them after a week being frozen to see if any of that made a difference in the bread. Not surprisingly, it did result in some very obvious differences between freezing and not freezing the bread when you waited until 7 days, which honestly doesn't really happen normally because the bread gets finished pretty quickly. So but just in case, if you're making this bread for yourself or you don't tend to eat bread every day, then you might want to go ahead and freeze it. So all the breads do gain a little bit of chew and density the day after baking. So if you love the softness, the super, super soft fluffiness, then you have to consume it right after you bake it. But if you are looking for a little bit more chew, a little more density, or you don't mind it, then you can totally wait until the day after to eat your bread. But for all the breads across the board, eating it within like 2 to 3 days is the most ideal. We felt that Chopstick Chronicles bread was the best on day 2 out of all the other breads. It's still very moist and fluffy with a delightful even bounce, especially compared to Umi's, which was a little bit more gummy and seemed like it had a slightly denser bottom than top. Both Princess Bamboos have more air pockets and a little bit more of a spongier texture than the rest, so you can imagine more fluff and less chew. It also has more bounce back compared to both Chopstick Chronicles and Umi's bread. Princess Bamboo's Udane bread had a slight tang, while the Tongzong had a little bit more of a fragrance. Both Josh and Inga's were denser and sweeter than the rest, more on the gummy than fluffy side. After a full week, there's a significant difference in the breads. Obviously, freezing the bread locks in the moisture and softness. And if you don't freeze the bread, you can feel the dryness and even some slight changes in the flavor for some of the loaves. Chopstick Chronicles was the least affected. Not really a change in texture, and barely any in taste. Umi's bread had a slight change in the flavor, but otherwise was just mainly a texture change. Interestingly, Inga's frozen bread resulted in a more, slightly yeasty flavor, but either way, her bread was still moist and more on the gummy side. The breads that showed the most significant difference between freezing and not were Princess Bamboo and Josh's. Without freezing, Princess Bamboo's loaves both felt old to touch, like drier and harder, but there wasn't a significant difference in taste. Freezing those breads gives you an even break when you try to tear them, rather than an actual tear. The Tongzong version that wasn't frozen was just a little bit drier on the tongue than the Udane that was not frozen. And freezing Josh's bread keeps it light and fluffy. It also breaks evenly instead of tearing. But if you leave the bread out for a week, it makes it pretty dry and dense. So the best storage tips is to eat all of it right away. But if you don't plan on doing that, then go ahead and slice your bread and freeze it for the best texture. And if you forgot to freeze it or you got a little too lazy, just pop it in the toaster and it'll be just as good. So which recipe was our personal favorite? It was Umi's baking. It was our favorite all-arounder. Great soft chew, not too gummy, just such a great all-around bread, like whether you're toasting it or you like it by itself, not toasted, because some folks prefer it that way. Whether you're making sandwiches or you're doing like a sweet peanut butter and jelly type of thing, perfect bread all around. We've made it many times now, and because her recipe already naturally makes 2 loaves, we were able to share it with a ton of friends and all good feedback. We've even tried it using soy milk, so you can substitute out the regular milk for soy milk and don't use any milk powder, and it's still really tasty. If you're looking for a bread that's a little bit more like the typical Asian white bread that you might use for sandwiches, we would recommend Chopstick Chronicles. And if you are looking for just one that leans a little bit slightly towards a more like Western loaf, with a little bit more like air pockets and such, then you might want to try Princess Bamboo. And if you are of the Hawaiian bread roll kind of fan, then definitely give Josh and Inga's a try. And if you're too lazy to do a starter, Inga's recipe is super fast and easy to do, although there's a longer rest time than using Umi's or Chopstick Chronicles recipes. And I think that is it. Yeah, so hopefully you really enjoy this series and our experiments. Let us know which recipe you're going to try or which one's your favorite in the comments below. Give us a thumbs like if you enjoy this video and the series. And don't forget to subscribe for more cooking adventures every Sunday. And join us on Scene to join the conversation. Our community is there and we'd love to hear from you. We'll see you on the next one. Thanks, guys. Bye.